Okay, so in part 2 of our social psych lecture, we're going to start by talking about the psychology of attitudes. So attraction means feeling drawn to other people. So things that can make someone attractive include things like their warmth, their trustworthiness, how adventurous the person is, physical characteristics, certain facial features, body proportions, and we look for people who are like us physically, with the same personality, have similar attitudes, and have similar psychological health. So we might also take a look at the socioeconomic and cultural environment that that person is coming from as we decide if that we feel that person is attractive or not. So one key thing to mention, in societies where food is in short supply, men look for women who are heavier. And where food's abundant, men look for women who are thinner. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about Philip Zimbardo. We've talked about him before. We talked about that Stanford prison experiment. And he's responsible for a lot of what we learned about cognitive dissonance. So that's that unpleasant state of psychological tension that occurs when two thoughts or perceptions are inconsistent. So attitudes can change due to cognitive dissonance, and it's pretty common. For example, people who quit smoking gave fewer rationalizations for smoking. If they started smoking again, they started being able to rationalize it again. Another good example, when choosing between two colleges, after you make your choice, you'll start emphasizing the negative features of the college that you rejected and emphasize the positive features of the one that you chose. So your book moves on and it talks about prejudice. So prejudice is a negative attitude toward people who belong to a specific social group. But one thing to keep in mind is that people from different groups are actually more alike than they are different, and that's something that people tend to forget. So differences can exist between members of different groups, but it's even more likely that differences exist between members of the same group. People, just because they're part of the same group, it doesn't mean they're all exactly the same. So conversations about prejudice usually revolve around age, race, religion, someone's sexual orientation, or maybe their gender identity. And so that kind of brings us into stereotypes. These are a cluster of characteristics that are associated with members of a specific group. So again, as we look at things like age, language, religion, skin color, and the stereotypes are based on assumptions that we have because a person belongs to a certain group. So for example, if we look at the elderly as being boring and we look at reckless youth, those are all stereotypes. Stereotypes that women can't drive, women don't know anything about cars. These are all stereotypes. And part of the reason why stereotypes are created, why our brain creates these stereotypes, is so that we can process and remember information more easily. But a lot of these mental shortcuts have problems. It can blind us to the true causes of events. It can really blind us to people, keep us from making connections. It can cause things like stereotype threat. And we might start to portray people negatively based on those stereotypes. And stereotypes are really hard to change once we've formed them, especially if they hold a little bit of truth. So your book actually talked about the example of the Red Sox fan meeting a nice Yankees fan. So when people get information that contradicts the stereotype that they have, they view it as an exception. Like, well, this is the one nice Yankee fan, but everybody else is horrible. So they start creating exceptions in order to keep that stereotype going. So stereotypes are also closely related to tendencies in a person's perception. We put people into two categories, the us and the them. And the us is that in group, the social group that we belong to. And the them is the out group, the group that we don't belong to. So when we look at behaviors of people in our own group, in that in group, we usually view their behaviors as being more favorable. If it's someone of the out group even doing the same thing, we might not view it the exact same way. So we'll move on and talk about implicit attitudes. So most people agree that prejudice and racism is wrong. And there are blatant displays of racist and sexist language, and they're no longer considered socially acceptable. Now, we've moved on from the blatant and obvious forms to more subtle forms, and we call those microaggressions. And it could even come from the subconscious. We can also measure these using that implicit association test that your book talks about. So in looking at overcoming prejudice, Sharif conducted a series of studies, looked at how easily people could develop hostility and distrust, how it can just be created among groups if you manipulate certain factors. So competitive situations usually increase tension. So he had his people pose as camp counselors, created two groups of people and said, okay, you're going to compete against each other. And in competing against each other, they would purposely create rivalries. And so then to try to decrease the hostility, they had them work together. And pretty soon they developed friendships. So they created a negative situation and then turned it around and showed that influence can have a big part of it. If you don't show people that they're an out group and you allow them to see that they're together, make those connections, friendships can form. So now we're going to talk a little bit about conformity. It occurs when you adjust your opinion, your judgments, your behaviors so that that matches what other people are doing, the norms of the situation. And social influence really involves looking at how behavior is influenced by other people. We all conform to group or situational norms. The question is, how far will we go? So Ash did the lines experiment. He's a psychologist, and this is back in 1955. He wanted to see if people would still conform to the group if the group opinion was clearly wrong. So he had a group of people sit at a table and look at these lines on the cards. And he asked very simply, which lines are the same? And at the table, all but one of the people sitting there was a part of the experiment. After a few correct answers, the group started to give wrong answers. The actual participant had a choice. Would he or she conform to the group or would he or she give the correct answer? It can be really uncomfortable to disagree with the majority of people. And so results of this, he discovered that 76% conformed on at least one of the cards. Some gave the right answer despite being the minority, and 95% defied the majority and gave the correct answer at least once. So some things that can influence conformity: negative social influence, a behavior motivated by the desire to gain social acceptance and approval. Ash also came up with a few factors that promote conformity, and you can find this in table 11.2 in your book. And some cultures actually encourage conformity, while others encourage people to be individuals. And so that plays a big factor in how people decide to conform or not conform. So I want you to take a look, and I have this video posted. I have a little video about conformity.
The
So I'd like
gentleman
for
in
you to
the
go
elevator
in
now
and get the link
is a
and
candid
watch
star.
this.
These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat.
So this will actually show you an example of conformity and people getting into an elevator and what happens when people practice conformity. So please take the time to go into the course and watch this video. And that concludes part 2, and part 3 will follow.